a traditional eatery, precariously close to collapse, was revitalized by a single act of kindness. Carter's Kitchen, a modest restaurant owned by a black man, found itself overwhelmed by unpaid bills and vacant tables. The city had undergone rapid changes. Fast food chains had siphoned off his clientele, and each night he secured the doors, pondering if that would be the last time. However, one frigid winter night, just as hopelessness threatened to overtake him, he spotted them, a homeless woman and her son, shivering on the cold pavement. In that moment, he recognized his own fortune that was greater than what many others out there faced. With one simple gesture of goodwill, everything began to transform. Inside Carter's Kitchen, the faint glow of the overhead lights scarcely illuminated the vacant tables. A small, traditional eatery tucked away in a quiet section of the city. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the freezing night air, settling gently into soft piles upon the sidewalk. Darius Carter, the owner and head chef of the restaurant, slumped over the counter, his eyes fixated on the stack of bills before him. His hands, hardened from years spent in the kitchen, formed fists as he scanned the ever-growing numbers. Rent overdue, utilities mounting, supplier invoices unpaid. The suffocating weight of failure bore down on him. He exhaled slowly while massaging his temples. This establishment was more than a business. It was his father's legacy, passed down with the hope that he would keep it alive. But everything had changed. The city had transformed. Fast food establishments had invaded from all directions, luring away customers with low prices and speedy service. He had witnessed the dwindling of his once loyal patrons, replaced by unsettling silence and empty seats. Although he still had regulars who cherished the warmth of homemade meals and the familiarity of his cooking, it wasn't sufficient. It never was. With a sigh, Darius pushed his chair back. It was late, and he had spent the previous few hours scouring the numbers once more, seeking a non-existent solution. He donned his coat, locked the front door, and stepped onto the icy sidewalk, the cold biting through his jacket, sending shivers coursing down his spine. He glanced up at the desolate street, his breath visible in the crisp night air. Everything felt lifeless, drained of the vibrancy that once characterized this neighborhood. As he turned to depart, movement caught his attention. Just a few feet away, huddled against the brick wall of a closed convenience store, sat a woman and a young boy, curled together under a tattered blanket. The child, no older than 7, pressed against his mother, trembling with cold, while she clutched the thin fabric tighter, her eyes scanning the street with weary caution. Stopping mid-stride, Darius momentarily forgot his exhaustion. He had walked past countless homeless individuals before, but something about this particular scene resonated with him profoundly tonight. Perhaps it was how the boy clung to his mother, small hands grasping her worn coat, as if she were his sole sanctuary. Perhaps it was the weary resignation in the woman's gaze, an exhaustion that transcended mere physical fatigue, one laden with a kind of hopelessness that gnawed at the soul. For a fleeting moment, Darius contemplated simply walking away. He had his own struggles. His restaurant was faltering, and his future was uncertain. He wasn't in any position to assist anyone. Yet an uninvited thought crept in. Undeniable, as grim as his situation was, he still had a place to go and options to choose from, whereas these two had nothing. His shoulders tightened as he wrestled with the dilemma, but the choice had already been made before he realized it. He pivoted back toward the woman and her son, his footsteps crunching on the frozen sidewalk. As he drew closer, the woman appeared tense, her grip tightening on the child, her eyes narrowing in cautious anticipation. "You don't have to be out here in this cold," Darius said, keeping his voice calm and gentle. He gestured toward the restaurant behind him. "I own that place. I just closed up, but I can make something hot for you both. You can warm up inside." The woman's jaw tightened, her fingers digging into the thin fabric of her coat, as if bracing for yet another harsh joke, another empty promise. "We're fine," she muttered, her voice low and guarded. Darius exhaled sharply, suppressing his frustration. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He wasn't seeking gratitude. The thought of walking away was simply unbearable. But before he could utter anything further, the little boy shifted, peering out from under the blanket. His dark eyes, wide and filled with hunger, flitted between his mother and Darius. "Mom," the boy whispered, his voice nearly inaudible. "I'm cold." The woman's posture stiffened for a long moment. She remained silent. Darius observed the inner turmoil. Within her, pride grappling with an instinctive need to protect her child. Then, with a resigned sigh, her shoulders slumped. "All right," she murmured, "just for a little while." Darius nodded and led the way back to the restaurant. As he unlocked the door and switched the lights back on, warmth spilled out, melting the chill that clung to his skin. The woman hesitated at the threshold, glancing around as if expecting a catch. However, her son didn't wait. He dashed inside, lured by the prospect of warmth and food. Darius watched the boy rub his hands together, his little fingers still stiff from the cold. Something tightened in Darius's chest as he motioned toward a booth close to the heater. "Sit down. I'll get something ready." Wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the woman eventually followed, settling into the seat across from her son. Darius stepped into the kitchen, pushing up his sleeves. His movements were automatic, chopping, stirring, plating, but his mind was restless. By the time he placed 2 steaming bowls of soup in front of them, the little boy was practically bouncing in his seat. He grabbed his spoon and dove in, immediately slurping the broth with a zeal that made Darius smirk. The woman, however, was more cautious, slow and hesitant. She lifted the spoon to her mouth, blew gently, and took a tentative sip. After a long pause, almost begrudgingly, she murmured, "That's good." Darius exhaled, some of the tension in his chest easing. He leaned against the counter, watching the boy devour his meal with unfiltered joy. For the first time that night, something within him felt right. Once they finished, Darius wiped his hands on a dish towel and glanced toward the back of the restaurant. "There's a storage room in the back. It has blankets and a couch. Not much, but warmer than out there." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Her instinct to decline battled against the harsh truth of their reality. Yet the boy looked up at her, hope flickering behind his exhaustion. She briefly closed her eyes, then nodded. "Okay." Darius turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered, attempting to dismiss the odd warmth settling in his chest. He locked up again before stepping outside to secure the front door. The cold air hit him once more, but this time, it didn't feel as biting. The next morning, well before the first light of dawn broke through the darkened sky, Darius Carter trudged toward his restaurant, the bitter cold biting at his exposed hands, his body aching from yet another restless night spent tossing and turning, plagued by unpaid bills and the slow, unavoidable collapse of all he had built. His mind began to drown in the same cycle of anxiety: how to pay rent, how to keep the lights on, how to survive another month. But as he reached the entrance of Carter's kitchen, something halted him mid-step. The glass windows, which had been obscured with dust and fingerprints the night before, now sparkled, reflecting the soft glow of the street lamp. His gaze dropped downward, and for the first time in weeks, the doormat was free from dirt and grime, furrowing his brow. He unlocked the door and cautiously stepped inside. The scent of cleaning solution mingled with warm air filled the space. The tables, once left in disarray, were arranged perfectly. The floors that had been dulled by constant movement gleamed under the light. Even the counter where stacks of unpaid bills had sat just hours before was wiped clean and organized into neat piles. His stomach tightened at the sound of quiet shuffling from the back. He walked toward the storage room, careful with his footsteps. When he opened the door, he found Maria and Ethan kneeling on the floor, meticulously folding a few leftover rags. The little boy was the first to spot him. Ethan's face brightened up, his dark curls bouncing as he jumped to his feet. Look, we cleaned everything. It was Mom's idea. She said if we're staying, we should help. Maria, adjusting a folded towel in the makeshift bed of blankets, stiffened slightly. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her sleeves, and met Darius's gaze with a hint of defiance, almost daring him to comment. Darius's fingers twitched at his sides. He was unsure how to respond. No one had ever done this for him. No customer, no friend, no one. He had been so accustomed to shouldering everything alone, battling against the tide without support, that he almost didn't know how to accept help. Gaze fixed on the now spotless surfaces and the faint scent of lemon in the air. His throat tightened. Finally, he found the right words. You didn't have to do this. Maria shrugged, her voice steady but distant. We know. Ethan grinned widely, bouncing on his heels. Did we do a good job? Darius exhaled, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck, and offered a small nod. Yeah, kid. You did good. Ethan's smile widened, his chest puffed with pride, while Maria maintained her unreadable expression. Darius sensed that she wasn't used to receiving words of appreciation either. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken sentiments. But there wasn't time to linger. He had a restaurant to run. Shaking himself, he turned back toward the kitchen. All right, I've got to start prepping for today. You two make yourselves comfortable, I guess. Walking behind the counter, he rolled up his sleeves. The morning prep routine was muscle memory by now. Pulling ingredients, chopping, seasoning, preparing for another day of uncertainty. Maria and Ethan lingered at the kitchen entrance, watching. For the first time, Darius felt the weight of their presence in his space. He wasn't used to working under anyone's gaze. After a few moments, Ethan broke the silence. Can we help? Darius shook his head. No need. Just take a seat. I'll fix you something before you head out. Maria appeared as if she wanted to argue, but something in Darius's tone made her halt. She simply nodded, taking Ethan's hand and guiding him to a booth near the heater. Darius focused on the task at hand. It had been ages since he had cooked for anyone who wasn't a paying customer. He opted for something simple, a warm, hearty omelet with a side of toast and roasted potatoes. Satisfying but easy on the stomach. The aroma of butter and eggs sizzling in the pan filled the air, the familiar rhythm of cooking temporarily drowning out his worries. When he finally plated the food and brought it over, Ethan practically vibrated with excitement. Wow! It smells so good, the boy exclaimed, grabbing his fork before Darius could even set the plate down. Maria, conversely, remained composed, her movements careful as she picked up her fork and took a small bite. Darius watched her reaction somewhat unintentionally. Ethan was already in full swing, relishing his food, humming with pleasure between bites. But Maria ate slowly, contemplative, then set her fork down. Darius picked up on the slight furrow in her brow, the way her fingers hovered over the plate, as if making mental adjustments. It's good, she finally said, but Darius arched a brow, crossing his arms, and Maria held his gaze unfazed. The seasoning on the eggs is off, she remarked. It's almost there, but it needs a sharper contrast, maybe a little smoked paprika or cayenne for a deeper flavor profile. Darius blinked, caught off guard. That wasn't the response he expected. Most people would simply express their thanks and leave it at that. Instead, Maria spoke like someone who understood food, not merely consumed it. He let out a quiet scoff. You critique free meals? Maria shrugged. You asked. Darius shook his head, but amusement tugged at the corners of his mouth. Rather than irritation, he found himself intrigued. You cook? He asked, half expecting her to brush off the question. Maria hesitated for a brief second, but then squared her shoulders. I used to. Something in her tone made Darius pause. The past tense held weight, rich in quiet bitterness. He studied her closely, observing how her lips pressed into a thin line before she finally revealed, "I was a head chef." Silence enveloped them, with even Ethan slowing his eating and glancing between the two as though sensing a shift in the conversation. Darius exhaled, running a hand down his face. "A head chef," he muttered, shaking his head slightly. "And you didn't think to mention that?" Maria's gaze was steady. "Didn't seem relevant." Darius barked a dry laugh. "Didn't seem relevant? You just critiqued an omelette like a damn food critic." Maria's expression remained inscrutable, yet a flicker of something passed through her eyes. A memory, perhaps, of a past she hadn't discussed in a long time. Darius exhaled, rubbing his jaw. He knew he shouldn't get involved. He had enough burdens. Yet there was something compelling here, about her words, her presence, her knowledge, that made him hesitate. After a lengthy moment, Maria finally spoke. "Look, I realize you're striving to keep this place afloat. I owe you for last night. Let me help, just until you figure things out." Darius narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Her expression softened. "Just a little. Because you provided my son with a warm place to sleep." Her words lingered heavily in the air between them, unspoken yet profound. Darius exhaled. His intuitions were telling him this was a poor idea, letting someone in, trusting a stranger. But then again, his gut had also encouraged him to abandon this restaurant months ago, and yet here he remained, still battling. Finally, he nodded once. "All right, let's see what you've got." The following days melted into a tranquil yet steady routine within Carter's kitchen. Darius still awakened each morning under the same weight pressing upon his chest. He continued to scrutinize his finances, witnessing the same bleak figures glaring back at him. He still grappled with the gnawing anxiety of whether that week would be the last. Yet, something had changed. Maria was now in the kitchen. At first, she worked quietly, maintaining her distance and displaying a kind of efficiency only found through experience. She asked no unnecessary questions and refrained from overstepping when Darius prepped for the day. If he diced onions, she was already preparing garlic. When he sampled a broth, she adjusted the heat on another pot before he even needed to say anything. It flowed seamlessly, a rhythm cultivated over years in a professional kitchen, and it settled between them as if it had always existed. The first time he witnessed her commandeer a dish, in silence, unwavering, it was almost instinctual. He had been struggling again with a new recipe meant to attract fresh patrons, something that needed to stand out yet kept falling flat. He stared at the plated dish in frustration, continuously tasting and tweaking the seasoning, knowing something was amiss, yet unable to pinpoint it. Observing, Maria approached, stepping forward without uttering a word, seizing the spoon from his hand to add just a pinch of something he hadn't even contemplated, smoked paprika, a hint of citrus zest. Then she slid the spoon back toward him. "Taste." Darius hesitated but took a bite. His jaw tightened as the flavors settled. It was better. Darn it. It was good. Maria simply crossed her arms. "You're overcomplicating it. Let the ingredients shine." Darius exhaled, staring at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're annoyingly good at this." Maria smirked, a genuine glimmer of amusement finally breaking through since she entered his establishment. "See, I told you my mom was a real chef." Ethan chimed in from his perch on a stool nearby, grinning like he had just witnessed a magician execute a trick. Just like that, everything shifted. Darius continued to handle most cooking tasks, but Maria became his extra pair of eyes and hands. She nudged him in the right direction when he hit obstacles, making it clear when something wasn't working without any ego, hesitation, or sugarcoating. It was simply about the food, getting it right, making it better. For the first time in a long while, Darius felt as though he was no longer drowning in solitude. By the end of the week, they had forged something substantial, a completely revamped menu that was modern yet true to its roots, packed with bold, comforting flavors that stood out. Yet, Food alone wasn't enough. They needed people to take notice. They needed customers. Hence, on Saturday morning, while the city was still awakening, they initiated the next part of their strategy. Darius wheeled out a cart to the front of the restaurant, displaying freshly plated samples of their new offerings. The air became infused with the enticing scents of sizzling spices and slow-cooked meats, combined with the warmth of fresh bread. The goal was straightforward: allow people to taste the food. If they enjoyed it, they would return. Ethan buzzed with anticipation. "Can I help?" Darius chuckled. "You good at talking to strangers, kid?" "Absolutely." Ethan beamed. "I talk to everyone." Maria, adjusting the plating on one of the samples, quirked an eyebrow. "He really does." Darius shook his head, handing Ethan a small tray of bite-sized portions. "All right, little salesman. Let's see what you've got." Ethan took his task very seriously, approaching anyone passing by with a broad smile and offering samples, as if he had been in the restaurant business forever. Some people brushed him off, but most paused, captivated by the enthusiasm of a child with a tray of free food. They took a bite, reacted, and then looked toward the restaurant, transforming curiosity into something more meaningful. Maria remained active as well. While Darius managed the kitchen, she engaged with patrons outside, confidently explaining the new menu and drawing them in with the assurance of a seasoned chef. Also, she was the one who recommended offering free samples to the homeless. If they were providing complimentary tastings, why not extend that kindness to those who needed it most? Without hesitation, Darius packed meals, proper portions, not scraps, and Maria and Ethan ventured down the block, distributing them to individuals huddled in alleyways and others sitting on sidewalks, those who usually went unseen. They asked for nothing in return. They simply gave. Unexpectedly, something remarkable happened. Word spread, not just about the food but about the restaurant's initiative. People began flocking in, not merely the regulars or curious bystanders, but newcomers drawn in by more than just a great meal. By mid-afternoon, the tables inside were bustling with customers for the first time in weeks. Darius barely had a moment to catch his breath as orders swirled in, plates flying out of the kitchen, voices filling the space reminiscent of the vibrancy this place once held. At one furious moment in the chaos, he caught Maria's gaze across the kitchen. She moved, with the same swiftness as he did, her hands steady, her focus sharp. Yet, there was something deeper there, a flicker of familiarity. She had been here before. She knew this rhythm. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed to belong. Darius smirked, wiping beads of sweat from his brow. "Not bad, chef." Maria didn't glance up from the dish she was plating, but he noticed her lips curve subtly at the title. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Carter's Kitchen had developed a waiting list. A month had rolled by, and the eatery was no longer teetering on the edge of closure. What had begun as a desperate effort to survive had morphed into something entirely different, a resurgence, a metamorphosis. The new menu had truly taken off, and word spread faster than Darius had ever anticipated. Certain days, the restaurant buzzed with activity from opening to closing, lines stretching out the door. Customers returned not just for the food but for the warmth of the atmosphere, the energy that hummed in the air, a sense of belonging to something larger. Darius continued to harbor concerns. He still reviewed the numbers nightly, sometimes calculating expenses in his mind before dozing off. But for the first time in what felt like forever, those numbers weren't just representing red ink or overdue notices, they were growing. Maria had seamlessly become the restaurant's backbone. It occurred so naturally Darius couldn't pinpoint precisely when the shift transpired. Perhaps it was the first time she corrected his plating before he could voice his discontent. Maybe it was as she began finishing his sentences mid-order, preemptively understanding what he required before he stated it aloud. Perhaps it was when he realized he wasn't alone in the chaos of a dinner rush anymore. Then, one night, after the final table had cleared and the last plate scrubbed clean, Darius leaned back against the counter, watching Maria wipe down the stove. She didn't glance up or interrupt her flow. He let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "You should be my head chef." Maria paused. Her hands, which had been moving methodically, came to a halt. Slowly, she turned to him, her eyes filled with unspoken thoughts. Darius shrugged as if it were a casual comment, though it was far from it. "You're already running the damn kitchen anyway. Might as well make it official." For a moment, she remained silent, the atmosphere thick with unspoken sentiments. Then, she swallowed, tightening her fingers around the rag in her hand. "You sure about that?" Darius chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'd be a fool not to be." Maria scrutinized him for an extended moment before letting out a sound so faint it almost faded beneath the hum of the quiet diner. Finally, she nodded. Ethan, sitting on a stool at the counter, shifted his gaze between them with wide eyes before breaking into a radiant grin. "That means we get to stay, right?" A tightness formed in Darius's chest. He hadn't thought about it that way, but the answer was crystal clear. "Of course you're staying." "Yeah, kid," he murmured, ruffling Ethan's curls. "You're stuck with me now." Maria rolled her eyes. Yet for the first time since she had entered his restaurant, her demeanor reflected a sense of belonging. That night, after Maria and Ethan had ventured to the back to settle in, Darius didn't immediately return home. Instead, he grabbed his coat, stepped out into the frigid night air, and walked 3 blocks to an old apartment complex, a rare find still renting at a decent price. He had made a few calls that morning, speaking with an acquaintance, and nailed down the details. The place wasn't luxurious, a small 1-bedroom with a reasonable kitchen and a reliable heater, but it was theirs if they desired it. The next day, when he informed Maria, she didn't reply immediately. She simply stood there, staring at him with an unreadable expression. After what felt like an eternity, she eventually nodded, slow and deliberate. "You don't have to, I know," Darius interjected. "But I want to." Maria didn't thank him in words, but as she entered the kitchen that morning, a different weight lent her an air of quiet acceptance, as if perhaps, just maybe, she didn't have to carry her burdens alone anymore. Thus, Carter's Kitchen transformed. It was no longer just Darius's restaurant, it was theirs. It had become a home. On the first Saturday morning following the launch of the new menu, Darius unlocked the doors, not only for paying customers but also for those who had nowhere else to turn. This started as a simple idea, Maria's idea. In fact, she knew what it felt like to sit on the other side of that door, watching people pass by, stomach empty, the cold seeping into her bones. Darius understood the sensation of almost losing everything and the fight for something that seemed unattainable. So, every Saturday morning, before the first orders of the day, Carter's Kitchen served free meals to those most in need. There was no catch, no strings attached, just a warm plate, a seat, and a moment of dignity. Initially, only a handful showed, those whom Maria and Ethan had encountered while still on the streets. But gradually, week after week, more arrived. Some stayed silent, eating in quietude, while others remained to converse, share stories. Some of them, like Maria once had, regarded the food before them as if it were the first real meal they had in years. Ethan took it upon himself to distribute trays, his small hands carrying plates with a sense of purpose most adults would envy. Maria, even amid the kitchen's frenzy, ensured every dish was plated correctly. Because it mattered, because these meals weren't merely charity. They were affirmations that people still cared. One morning, a woman entered, shoulders hunched, arms encircling a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. She rarely spoke, barely met anyone's gaze. Yet when she took her seat and consumed that first bite, something in her expression shifted, if only for a fleeting moment. Maria caught sight of her, and for the first time since this journey began, she left the kitchen, approached the woman, and sat down opposite her. She didn't say much. She merely slid a napkin across the table, nodded, and stayed there. Darius observed it all. He truly saw what they were creating. This was no longer just a business. It had transcended mere survival. It was evolving into something larger, something significant. Perhaps, just perhaps, Carter's Kitchen had never been meant to be solely his to begin with. Join us in sharing meaningful stories by clicking the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to enable the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.